Welcome to Learn the Word, the daily Bible teaching program of Calvary Chapel of Delta and Pastor Doug McLean. As we continue in Psalm 68, we're joining Pastor Doug to look at David's example of how our praise can point others to the Lord. So let's take a look in Psalm 68 and verse 11.
David continued in verse 11, again recounting the things the Lord did. Verse 11, the Lord gave the word, great was the company of those who proclaimed it. Kings of armies flee, they flee, and she who remains at home divides the spoil. Though you lie down among the sheepfolds, you will be like the wings of a dove covered with silver, and her feathers with yellow gold. Now, if you study this, you'll find that many scholars have differing opinions on these verses. This is one of the most difficult sections in the entire book of Psalms to translate from Hebrew into English. But I believe we can get the sense of what's being said here. For example, when it says the Lord gave the word, that word is used for a command or a speech, a saying. It's different from the word typically translated word when we think of the Bible, the word. It's different. This word is only used 6 times in the Old Testament. And here the sense is that the Lord gave them a command. He was commanding his people as they went to war, that he gave them a command. And they passed it on. They proclaimed it. And they went out according to the Lord's direction. And as they did, they experienced victory and brought home the spoils. You see, kings of armies flee, they flee, and she who remains at home divides the spoil. Those that stayed at home were able to enjoy the spoils. In verse 13, the poetic picture is of protection and enrichment in humility. If you're lying down in a sheepfold when a war is going on, you're taking cover. You're hiding. You're in a humbled position. And he's saying that those who are in that humbled position, lying down in a sheepfold, are going to be covered. They're going to be protected, but in a glorious way. The picture is wings that a bird would use to cover its young under its mother's wing. But yet here, these wings, interestingly, are covered in silver and gold. So there's beauty, there's glory that comes through that enrichment, that comes through that experience. So he's saying, as you go in, as you're following the orders, even those that feel like they have to hide are going to be covered, and they're going to be beautified, and they're going to be enriched through that experience. That's fascinating. If you go back and you study the history of Israel and how they conquered the land, if you think about it, what he's saying here is when they went into the land, remember the Lord had to say to Joshua several times, be strong and courageous, do not fear, I am with you. Be strong and courageous, do not fear, I am with you. He had to say it several times to Joshua as he was leading. And what's being said here is as they went into battle, as they went into war, they weren't to fear, but they didn't have to go in like they had great confidence. They just had to go in. They just had to go in, and the Lord would work on their behalf. They could be hiding under the sheepfolds. It didn't matter. The Lord would work on their behalf. It's just like Paul when he went to Corinth. Remember, he said, I was with you in weakness and fear and in much trembling. He didn't have to go in and say, I'm the Apostle Paul, and I'm here to save you. He could go in with weakness and fear and in much trembling. It didn't matter how he went. He just went. And the Lord showed up. When Joshua went in, it didn't matter how they went in, they just went in. And the Lord was with them, and the Lord did the work. In fact, look at verse 14. It says, when the Almighty scattered the kings in it, it was white as the snow. And Zalman, what's that mean? Well, Zalman was a mountain near Shechem. Shechem's in the center of the land. When snow fell on Zalman, it didn't last very long. When snow falls there, it melts very quickly. So the picture is when the Lord brought his people in, the kings that fought against Israel didn't last very long. They just, like the snow on Zalman, it was there and then gone. They were just wiped out. They melted away. Verse 15 continues, a mountain of God is the mountain of Bashan. A mountain of many peaks is the mountain of Bashan. Why do you fume with envy, you mountains of many peaks? This is the mountain which God desires to dwell in. Yes, the Lord will dwell in it forever. Now, all the mountains are mountains of God. When you think about it, the earth is the world's and the fullness thereof. He owns everything. All the mountains belong to him. The mountains of Bashan that are mentioned here are the mountains that we call the Golan Heights today. So up towards the north of Israel, between Israel and Syria, Israel and Lebanon. Up in that area, up in the north, are the Golan Heights. The northern part of the ridge of the Golan Heights ends at a mountain called Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon has its three biggest peaks are over 9,000 feet above sea level. It's a very large mountain. For a good part of the year, it has snow on it. Huge mountain in that area. So the picture here is of this huge multi-peak mountain being envious of the mountain that the Lord desires to dwell in. David says this is the mountain of God that he desires to dwell in. He's speaking of the mountain where he was when he wrote this psalm, which is Mount Zion. This big, huge mountain up in the north, Mount Hermon, is envious of the mountain, Mount Zion in Jerusalem, which is like a hill. It's a small, little mountain. That's the one that God desires to dwell in. That's where David lived. That is where God chose to dwell. Psalm 132, 13 to 14 says this. Psalm 132, 13 to 14. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell. I have desired it. So the greater significance, the more enviable position was not because of height or size or grandeur, but rather the more enviable position was because of the one who chose to dwell there. Mount Zion was more significant because God chose it for his temple. God chose it. Later on, it will be the capital of his kingdom. David recognizing that here. Verse 17 says, the chariots of God are 20,000, even thousands of thousands. The Lord is among them as in Sinai in the holy place. So thousands of thousands are millions. This is describing huge military power, great strength, simply by being with the Lord, being in the presence of the Lord. Like when Elijah and his servant were in Dothan, 2 Kings chapter 6. Do you remember that the Syrians came down, surrounded Dothan where Elisha and his servant were staying? The servant woke up first, went outside, and saw the army of Syria surrounding the town. He came freaking out to Elijah. We're surrounded, we're surrounded. And Elisha looked at him and he said, well, don't worry, there are more with us than there are with them. And then he prayed, Lord, open his eyes that he might see. And this servant, his eyes were open, and he saw chariots of fire surrounding them, between them and the Syrian army. Look, with the Lord is the safest place to be. With the Lord is the safest place to be. He's got an army unmatched. Now, in verse 18, he continues to describe or address the Lord, speaks to the Lord. In verse 18, he says, you have ascended on high. You have led captivity captive. You have received gifts among men, even from the rebellious, that the Lord God might dwell there. So, think about this. David said to the Lord, you have ascended, which means you must have first descended. He's saying to the Lord, you have ascended. Remember, 1,000 years before Christ, he's saying to the Lord, you have ascended, which means he must have first descended. In fact, this is the point that Paul made in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 9, as he quoted this psalm. Listen to the context, Ephesians chapter 4, 7 to 10. This is what he said. But to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore, he says, when he ascended on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts to men. Now this, he ascended, what does it mean but that he also first descended into the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is also the one who ascended far above the heavens that he might fill all things. So for the Lord to ascend on high means that he first had to descend. That's Jesus, the Lord, who left heaven to live here. He descended. To die here, he descended. To arise. By the way, verse 1. Let God arise. let his enemies be scattered. He came down and he rose up, and the resurrection, the truth of the resurrection, scatters his enemies. Death, sin, the devil, the resurrection. Then he ascended, and Acts chapter 1 verse 9 says that when he ascended, a cloud received him out of their sight. Remember verse 4, Psalm 68? Extol him who rides on the clouds. Interesting, isn't it? It's prophetic, it's messianic, it's pointing to Jesus. He led captivity captive, we're told. Now, when people died before the cross, when believers died before the cross, the Bible teaches that they went to a place called Abraham's bosom, or paradise. You can see Jesus tells the story of this in Luke chapter 16. A man named Lazarus, a poor beggar, dies, and a rich man dies. The poor beggar goes to Abraham's bosom, to paradise. The rich man goes to a place of torment. Before the cross, sin could be covered by symbolic sacrifice. They were given sacrifices that symbolically covered sin, but they weren't put away. When Jesus died on the cross, he died for all the sins of the world, from Adam to the last man, to you, to me. He died for all the sins of the world. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 39 to 40, Hebrews 11, 39 to 40, says that all those that had faith that died before the cross were not made perfect apart from us. It wasn't complete yet. So when Jesus died on the cross, he died for their sins. And he went to Abraham's bosom, to paradise, and emptied it out and took everyone that was waiting for him by faith into glory, into the presence of the Father. He led captivity captive. He emptied that place down and ushered everyone into the presence of the Father. All the sins were removed completely. They had been paid for completely on the cross of Calvary. He led captivity captive. And here in our translation, the word says that he received gifts among men. In Ephesians, when Paul quotes the passage, he says he gave gifts to men. Here it says receive gifts from men. There it says he gave gifts to men. And this is written in such a way, it can be translated either way. The idea is that he received gifts to be given to men. You could say he received gifts for men, even for the rebellious. If you look at that verse when it says even from the rebellious, the word from is in italics, which means it was inserted by the translators. It's not there in the translation. He received gifts for men, even for the rebellious. The idea is that he gives gifts. After ascending, he gives gifts even to the rebellious. In fact, look at the verse 19 for clarity. If you ever need clarity in a passage, just back up, read the one before it, read the one after it, or read on. Look at verse 19. Here we have clarity. Verse 19, our God, blessed be the Lord who daily loads us with benefits, the God of our salvation, Selah. So he daily loads us with benefits. Context, even the rebellious. Remember, Jesus said he makes his sun shine and the rainfall on the just and the unjust. Even the rebellious. He gives gifts by his grace. Unmerited favor. He gives gifts. That's what we're talking about here, not wages. Wage is what you deserve. A gift is what you don't deserve. It's just given to you. He gives gifts even to the rebellious. You can't earn his gifts. If you want to be gifted by the Lord, you can't be good enough to earn gifts from the Lord. And if you've been rebellious, he can still gift you. He can still give gifts to you. He can still use your life because he's gracious. Now notice, why does he give gifts? What does it say in verse 18? That the Lord God might dwell there. Why does the Lord give gifts? In other words, we're gifted so that we can experience the presence of God in our midst. The gifts we've been given that flow out of his ascension, since he's in glory, the gifts that are given so that the world knows he's still here and he's working here. Remember, Jesus said it this way. He said to those who believe in him, he said, the works that I do, you will also do, and even greater works, because I go to the Father. Not greater in importance, but greater in number, because he'd send his Spirit and he would gift his people to do more works. John 14:12. And he's given those gifts to let the world know he's here. You can see an example of that in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. 1 Corinthians 14:24 and 25. There, the Apostle Paul said, 1 Corinthians 14:24 and 25, he said, if all prophesy, and an unbeliever or an uninformed person comes in, he is convinced by all, he is convicted by all, and thus the secrets of his heart are revealed, and so falling down on his face, he will worship God and report that truly God is among you. See, gifts are given so that people know that God is here, that he's among us. So he loads us with benefits so the world can see God, the God of our salvation. Why? Verse 20, our God is the God of salvation, and to God belong escapes from death. So maybe you can look back on your life and remember the times that you almost didn't make it, the times that the Lord spared your life. And certainly he has done that for me. He probably has done that for you. But even greater than that, he's the God of salvation. Jesus said in John 11:25 and 26, John 11:25 and 26, he said, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live, and whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? So if you want to never die and you want to end up forever in glory, you need to know the Lord Jesus Christ. You need to know the one that has escapes from death. And so he gifts us, he equips us, he empowers us so that the world can know that he's alive and then know that he's working, because he desires that none would perish and that all would come to a saving relationship with Jesus. Verse 21, but God will wound the head of his enemies, the hairy scalp of the one who still goes on in his trespasses. So no doubt a reference to Genesis 3:15, the seed of the woman who would crush the skull of the serpent, the dragon of old, the devil, and the seed of the woman, the virgin-born Son of God, and how he would wound the head of his enemy. He would take out the enemy's head. Romans 16:20, Paul said to the church, Romans 16:20, and the God of peace will crush Satan under your feet shortly. It's coming. The enemy will be defeated. And so now's the time to be saved. Now's the time to come to his side, to turn from your trespasses. It's going on in trespasses, continually, willfully in sin, that lands a person in big trouble. You can see that. The hairy scalp of the one who still goes on in his trespasses, they're in trouble. God will wound their head. Verse 22, the Lord said, I will bring back from Bashan, I will bring them back from the depths of the sea, that your foot may crush them in blood, and the tongues of your dogs may have their portion from your enemies. So there's no hiding from the Lord. There's those that try to get away, but they won't be able to. And even those who died will be resurrected. All will be resurrected. Those that died in unbelief will be resurrected to stand in judgment. Revelation chapter 20 tells us that. There is no escape. Now, this next section, as we go on, is could have been inspired when David successfully brought the ark into Jerusalem, but it also points ahead to the day when Jesus literally takes the throne in Jerusalem. Look at verse 24. It says, "They have seen your procession, O God, the procession of my God, my King, into the sanctuary. The singers went before, the players on instruments followed after. Among them were the maidens playing timbrels. Bless God in the congregation of the Lord from the fountain of Israel. There is little Benjamin, their leader, the princes of Judah and their company, the princes of Zebulun and the princes of Naphtali. Your God has commanded your strength. Strengthen them, O God, what you have done for us." Now, look, notice here, my God, my King. Literally, God is King in Jerusalem, reigning, being worshiped, with Israel restored by God in the land, ascending, coming up to Jerusalem, southern and northern kings to worship the Lord. Verse 29, "Because of your temple at Jerusalem, kings will bring presents to you. Rebuke the beast of the reeds, the herd of bulls, of the calves of the people, till everyone submits himself with pieces of silver. Scatter the peoples who delight in war. Envoys will come out of Egypt. Ethiopia will quickly stretch out her hands to God." So people will come from all over the world to Jerusalem, to God, to worship, to honor, to submit, to bring gifts to him. And so the exhortation in verse 32, "Sing to God, you kingdoms of the earth. O sing praises to the Lord. To him who rides on the heaven of heavens, which were of old. Indeed, he sends out his voice, a mighty voice." So he's speaking, he's on the move, and David here is calling people to worship him. Verse 34, "Ascribe strength to God. His excellence is over Israel, and his strength is in the clouds. O God, you are more awesome than your holy places. The God of Israel is he who gives strength and power to his people. Blessed be God." So here in verse 34, he's calling people to recognize God's strength, and specifically to recognize how God has used his strength for Israel. You want to see evidence of a living God? Study the history of Israel. He's made promises to them that he's kept. And he's worked in amazing ways to keep his people together and to give them, as a nation, a land. You think about it, shortly after Jesus ascended into heaven, just 40 years after, the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem. And that began another dispersion from the land, where the people were driven from the land. For over 1,800 years, Israel was not in their land, and they maintained their identity as a people. They maintained their culture. They maintained their connection. And then in the late 1800s, the Zionist movement began, and people started moving back to Israel. And then in 1948, they became a nation again. Unprecedented that a people would be so long away from their land and not just meld into their culture, but then to come back into the land. And God promised that he would gather them again a second time. So if you want to see God's strength manifest in a practical way in human history, just look at Israel. And you can see that God, even in Israel's rejection of Christ, even in Israel's rebellion against God, God is still merciful and gracious and has brought them back as a people into the land. And the world didn't want it to happen, doesn't want it to happen, is opposed to it, and yet God has fulfilled his plan. That's evidence of God's strength. And here the psalm is pointing to that. Recognize his strength. Ascribe strength. Ascribe strength to God. His excellence is over Israel. His strength is in the clouds, far beyond anything that any strength that we have. In verse 35, I really love it, because you get to the end and it just says that he is greater than any place that is set aside for him, greater than any tabernacle, greater than any temple, greater than any church, greater than any individual. He's the one that is the greatest. He is the giver. He is the one that hands down strength to his people. He does it, and so he should be worshiped.
Not only should we praise the Lord, but as we do, it points others to him. You've been listening to the message, When God Moves, from Psalm 68. If you missed any part of this episode, or you'd like to go back and listen to more of our recent programs, you can find them on the Learn the Word Radio podcast. Just go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and search for Learn the Word Radio to subscribe for free. We're so glad you joined us for today's program. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue our pursuit to learn the Word.